I am just sort of overjoyed to be here. Of course, before I talk about that joy, I'd like to thank Kenyon for, of course, that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank Stephanie for organizing and helping to organize this event. No offense to Stephanie and Kenyon, but I most importantly would like to thank you all for coming here tonight. I mean, I know it's not hard to come here, as beautiful it is, but you certainly could have, been down the street watching the 54th installment of Spider-Man or something like that. And so, I certainly do not, and I would imagine Grace Farms does not take for granted your presence. And so I'd like to thank you. It's the reason why I'm saying that I'm sort of overjoyed is because, as many of you see, because that this place is really a beautiful place. And I've talked about all day the ways in which sort of this place, its architecture, its nature really affirms sort of humanity and really sort of speaks to what's possible and really speaks to the best of humanity, what humans can create, what humans can do for each other. And these are the types of spaces and places that I like to go to and that I like to spend my time at. And, because we really, especially during these difficult times, have to regularly sort of see and envision and believe what's possible, right? The beauty that's possible for humans, despite all the ugliness that may be around us. I'm actually about to move to some of that ugliness. I'm about to move to Washington, D.C. So I wish I had Grace Farms in my backyard. But anyway, that's another lecture. So, again, it's truly an honor to sort of be here. And clearly, coming to Connecticut, I wanted to sort of begin my discussion describing a story that involves somebody who I think has been in the news a lot recently. This isn't somebody who the president said who's still alive. I'm not talking about Frederick Douglass. I'm talking about John C. Calhoun. And those of you may or may not know, for the first few decades of the United States, slavery as an institution was largely justified based on this largely Jeffersonian notion that slavery was a necessary evil. That was the term, that was the logic that Americans largely used to justify and really sustain American slavery. It's a necessary evil. By the 1830s, an abolitionist movement rose up. And that abolitionist movement, led by people like William Lloyd Garrison, started making the case that no, slavery is an unnecessary evil. The new American Anti-Slavery Society in 1835 sent upwards of 1 million pamphlets all over the country, mostly in the South, showing in a visual manner that slavery was this unnecessary evil. And in 1835, slaveholders thought that they were being invaded, literally, by anti-slavery propaganda, by the anti-slavery movement that was emerging in America. And it was very difficult for them to respond to this idea that slavery was a necessary evil, especially with the images and the ideas that were being put forth by the Anti-Slavery Society. And so slaveholders leaned on the person who was really emerging as the principal defender, intellectual defender of slavery, none other than John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun in the 1830s was a senator from South Carolina, also a slaveholder, a former US vice president. And in 1837, John C. Calhoun stood up before his colleagues in the US Senate and declared, in response to a Virginia slaveholder who said slavery is a necessary evil, he stood up in response and said, no, slavery is a positive good. Slavery is a positive good for black people. They've come to America and become civilized out of the barbarism of Africa, and slavery is a positive good for America because you can't have a nation without inequality. That inequality is normal. And of course, it's good for America due to the riches that are emerging out of slave labor. So slavery is a positive good. And he pushed this idea of slavery as a positive good because he recognized that the old justification for slavery as a necessary evil was under assault, was falling by the wayside, and that slaveholders needed a new justification. And he put forth the idea of slavery being a positive good. Now, anybody who had any close or even distant connection to slavery should or could know that slavery was not a positive good, right? But he made this case. Now, of course, he made this case and then he had to justify it, right? And I'm sure some of you are like, how could somebody justify, right, that slavery was a positive good? Well, actually, something happened. In 1840, the United States engaged in the compiling of its census. And the census had a new category, the 1840 census, and that category was insanity. And so basically census takers began sort of collecting how many insane people were in New Canaan, how many was in Gainesville, where I currently live, how many were in Queens, where I was born, cataloging and how many insane people were in each place. A Harvard-trained researcher who was also interested in psychiatry by the name of Edward Jarvis began looking at this census data. This census data that showed the levels of insanity in different places. And he began to see something that was quite interesting. He found that black people were more likely to be insane in the North than in the South. Actually, he found that black people were 10 times more likely to be insane in the North than in the South. So he took this data, and then his analysis was that, I guess slavery must be anybody want to guess? A positive good. Because freedom is literally doing what to black people? Driving them crazy, right? So he took this data and his analysis and published it in the New England Journal of Medicine. Anybody know anything about the New England Journal of Medicine, right? It just so happens to be then, as it still is today, the most prestigious medical journal in the world. He published this data. Now, in the New England Journal of Medicine, and his analysis that slavery was good for black people because freedom was driving them insane. I mean, the data shows it. John C. Calhoun and other slaveholders who had began to defend slavery based on this notion of slavery as a positive good, what do you think they did with that study? You see, Edward Jarvis, a Harvard-trained scholar, has just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the finest journal in the Western world of medicine, just what we have been saying for years. Slavery is a positive good. So they took this study and used it to defend their thesis that they created to defend what? Slavery. Edward Jarvis decided to continue to look at the data. And the more he looked at the data, the more he saw problems. And those problems were that he began to see that some northern towns had more black insane people than they had black residents. Everybody hear that? So he saw that some northern towns had more black insane people than they had black residents. And so he, being somebody who would go on to found the American Statistical Association, decided, along with some of the other founders of the American Statistical Association, to basically try to challenge and look into this problem of the census of 1840. That clearly this must be wrong. Like, you just can't have more insane people than you have residents in a town. Something must be wrong. This data must be collected anew. Clearly, my original analysis and even my original data in that article in the New England Journal of Medicine was wrong. So he actually published a new article. He wasn't able to get this new one in the New England Journal of Medicine, in a lesser journal, sort of recanting his old sort of piece. Now, at the time, the Secretary of State in the mid-1840s was responsible for investigating, overseeing, and therefore investigating the census. Who was the Secretary of State? John C. Calhoun. What did John C. Calhoun do? John C. Calhoun did, quote, an investigation and found there was nothing wrong with the census of 1840, and that these people, these founding scholars who ended up founding the American Statistical Association, who were leading the push to get the 1840 census investigated and potentially changed, they just did not want to accept the fact that slavery is a positive good for black people. And that's why they're challenging this census. And of course, those statisticians, statisticians know things like 1 + 1 = 2. These basic things, they were completely perplexed, right? How could John C. Calhoun do this? How could he not see that there's a problem here that needs to be investigated and solved? Let me fast forward to recent years to give you another story that you'll probably be more familiar with. The United States elects its first black president. After the election of Barack Obama, and even to a certain extent before the election of Barack Obama, certain American intellectuals and politicians and others were making the case that if America elects Obama, or now that America has elected Obama, it must mean that America is post-racial. Obama's election demonstrates that the nation is post-racial. And so, as many of you know, during Obama's first term, there was all this talk from certain forces in our society that his election demonstrates that this nation is post-racial. And by 2013, even the Supreme Court had been led to believe that the nation was post-racial, such that it allowed for the elimination of the federal pre-clearance, which was a singular or signature aspect of the Voting Rights Act, which basically made it such that if certain states changed their voting laws, it had to be pre-cleared by the federal government. The Supreme Court stated in a case in June of 2013 that's no longer needed because the nation is post-racial. Shortly thereafter, those states and other states began passing a series of voter ID laws. Voter ID laws that basically made it such that in order to vote, you had to have an ID. In certain states like Alabama, not only did they pass a voter ID law, but they shut down the DMVs where people could get IDs. So these voter ID laws began to proliferate in in states across the country, some stronger than others, some being struck down like North Carolina's law in 2016 by a court that stated that these laws target black voters with precision. But then these new laws had to be justified, especially when people started to say, okay, why do you have these new laws? What are they for? So the forces made the case that these laws were created because there's a voter fraud problem. There's a voter fraud problem in our country. And then when people did what we should do, okay, let's investigate to see if there's actually a voter fraud problem. And when they came back and said, and found that no, that's actually not a voter fraud problem, that we actually get more reports of people being abducted by aliens than we do reports of voter fraud. And they presented it to these politicians who were creating these voter ID laws on the basis that they were eliminating voter fraud. These politicians suddenly did not say, oh, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. We thought that there was a voter fraud problem. No, they doubled down and created even more sophisticated policies. And it's my contention and the contention of others that this was the reason why the current president was elected, because votes were suppressed in key swing states. Take Wisconsin, for instance, where some estimates state that upwards of 200,000 votes were suppressed because of its voter ID laws. And how many votes did Donald Trump win? By about 22,000. And so, but then after the election, the people who did not vote for Trump started looking around and pointing fingers and blaming black people. Well, y'all should have came out to vote. Okay, we tried to come out to vote and we couldn't vote. Or they blamed women, or they looked around and stated the problem was people. There's something wrong with the people. And those who instituted and benefited from those policies sat back and enjoyed that finger pointing of people. I give you these sort of two opening stories to give you a sense of how I came to the thesis that made up Stamped from the Beginning. And it was a thesis that I did not expect to sort of come to when I began researching for this history of racist ideas. I fully expected to write a history where ignorance and hate, and those who were just ignorant about black people, or even hated black people, that these were the people, because of their ignorance and hate, who were creating racist ideas, suggesting that there was something wrong or inferior about black people. I thought that ignorance and hate was leading to racist ideas. And I thought that it was these people who had these racist ideas, that these were the people who were creating racist policies like slavery or Jim Crow or even mass incarceration today. That's what I thought. But in writing and researching for Stamped from the Beginning, I ended up distinguishing between the producers of racist ideas and the consumers of racist ideas. I ended up distinguishing between the people who produced the idea that slavery was a positive good and the people who consumed that idea and started thinking, oh man, you know what, slavery is a positive good. You know, freedom is driving black people insane. I ended up distinguishing between the people who produced the idea that there's a voter fraud problem in Jamaica Queens, where I'm from, or East New York, or North Philadelphia, the people who produced the idea, and then the people who consumed that idea and went and got their guns and went to these polling sites to prevent the fraud, right? I wanted to study the producers of racist ideas. I wanted to study them, and I wanted to understand fundamentally, why were they producing these ideas at that time in history? Why in 1837 did John C. Calhoun say this? Not 1827, not 1847, right? Why did these people produce these ideas? And I found over and over again that these people were not ignorant, that in many cases they were some of the most brilliant American minds, and that they were not hateful. Some of them loved, maybe loved probably isn't the best word, some of them liked black people. Some of them had long extended relationships with black people, a la Thomas Jefferson. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, so I make sure. And so I realized again that these people were not ignorant and hateful, that these people were producing these ideas to justify existing racist policies that typically benefited them. That really the origins or the cradle have historically been economic, political, or even cultural self-interest. And that it was this self-interest driving the creation of racist policies. And then the need to defend those racist policies were driving the production of racist ideas. And those consuming those racist ideas were becoming ignorant and hateful. And so what we have historically been taught of ignorance and hate leading to racist ideas, which leads to racist policies, that has actually been the inverse. That it's actually been the inverse throughout American history. When we study and focus our attention on the producers, and we understand what was causing them to produce those ideas at that particular point in time in history. And I think most of us can understand how you're a slaveholder, you're making money enslaving black people, an abolitionist movement rises up to threaten, right, your wealth, that you're going to create or even support ideas suggesting that these people should be enslaved, right? That you see that as part of your self-interest. I think people can understand that. I think people can understand how and why a politician who knows that people think that there's a crime problem and that they're going to create and produce ideas stating that, yes, there is a very, very bad crime problem in this country, well, not in the whole country, just in black neighborhoods, and that I am going to be the president of law and order, a la the current president or even Richard Nixon. And that then people are going to be like, you know what, they're going to defend me from those young black males who threaten my life, right? Even though when we look at the data, that's actually not happening, but these politicians recognize historically and have recognized the ways in which they can manipulate their white and even black constituents with the racist ideas that they already have about black people. And politicians have historically done that. Or even a scholar or a professional who recognizes that the money in terms of getting a grant is in producing or defending this popular racist idea. So I'm going to gear my career towards that. Because in gearing my career towards defending or producing that idea, I'm going to be able to be handsomely rewarded financially and even professionally, right? That they would see that in their self-interest. This is really the story, again, that I tell in Stamped from the Beginning. And what this ultimately means is that I think we need to rethink the function of racist ideas. I don't think we've ever really, as a nation, had a very clear and honest discussion about the function of racist ideas. And what I mean by that is, so I'm a huge New York Knicks fan. I know. So, it's been and I heard, though, today that, Kyrie Irving, anybody who knows basketball, so Kyrie Irving was a starting point guard for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cleveland Cavaliers played in the NBA Finals, that he's demanding a trade from Cleveland, and the New York Knicks are one of the teams he wants to go to. But anyway, so in the 90s, anybody who's a Knicks fan or follows basketball or sports a little bit knows that there was this huge rivalry between the New York Knicks and what team? The Chicago Bulls, right? So I personally do not like Michael Jordan, because of that. If he literally came to my door, I would just shut it. I don't have a second ring on my finger because of Michael Jordan. And so what I'm ultimately sort of getting at is you had this team. You had the New York Knicks. Good players, some not so good players. You had the best players like Patrick Ewing and John Starks and Allen Houston, and then the Chicago Bulls, same thing. You had your really good players, Michael Jordan, and then people I would consider to be bums, like, Luke Longley and others. And see, you've never heard of Luke Longley because, he wasn't really that good. So you had these two teams, right? And the Bulls every year beat the Knicks. Every year beat the Knicks. And so then the question becomes, why did year after year the Bulls beat the Knicks? There's only two explanations why this one group of people consistently, year after year, beat this other group of people. Either the Bulls were a better team, a superior group, or, like I believed, that the NBA was cheating for the Bulls. And if you want to know about that, I can talk to you about that afterwards, right? It's either, those are the only two causes, right, of one team consistently beating another team year after year. Either that team is a better team, or that team or the forces in which that team is operating in is cheating. So when we think about that from a racial standpoint, from the beginning of this country, there has been racial disparities. White Americans have been on the winning and living end of American society, and black people have been on the losing and largely dying end of American society. And there's only two explanations. There's only two explanations for any racial disparity that has ever existed in this country, that still exists today. Either there's something wrong or inferior with black people. Either white people are the better team, either they're a superior group of people, or somebody's cheating, which from a racial standpoint is called racial discrimination. Those are the only two causes, right? And so let's say if you are engaging in the cheating and benefiting from the cheating, i.e. a slaveholder, you are going to want people to believe that the reason why white people are winning is because they're the superior team. Because what that's going to do is that's going to prevent, and you also want black people to believe that too. Because what that's going to do is it's going to prevent everyone from doing what? Challenging or even looking for, let alone challenging, the racist policies that are actually creating the disparity. Right? Because again, there's only two causes. So if you've been led to believe that black people are inferior, then you're not even going to look for, let alone challenge, the policies that I would argue are actually creating the disparity. And so therefore, those who are benefiting from those policies, those producers, those powerful Americans, are going to continue to benefit from them because you and I are not challenging them. And so what happens, therefore, in a nutshell, is the function of racist ideas is to suppress resistance to racial discrimination. That's how racist ideas have historically functioned. Those who have consumed and wholeheartedly believe racist ideas, what they do is they blame black people for racial problems. They blame black people for racial disparities. Those who believe the racial groups are equal, who have been able to guard against consuming those racist ideas, see the problem as racial discrimination and engage in work or support or are sympathetic to work that challenges racial discrimination. And therefore, those who benefit don't like you because you're challenging what they benefit from. And so, to think about this in a more simple way, I ended up defining a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. Any idea suggesting a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. Because again, with any sort of racial disparity, if you believe any sort of inferiority for a racial group, then that's going to explain that disparity. That's going to explain that inequality. Because when we think about our racial discussion, or I should say argument, that Americans have been engaged in from the beginning of this country, it's been seeking to answer a fundamental question. Why does racial inequality exist in this country? That's the fundamental question Americans have been arguing about from the beginning. And you've had those stating that it's because something wrong with black people, and you've had those who've claimed it's something wrong with discrimination. And so, again, when I say, and I ended up defining it as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way, I think there are many sort of keys to that definition. First is racial group. So, Stand from the Beginning is a book about anti-black racist ideas. So it's about ideas that have been created that stated that there's something wrong with a black racial group. And black people, like other races, are a collection of racial groups. In other words, black women are a racial group. Black men are a racial group. The black poor are a racial group. Black elites are a racial group. Black lesbians are a racial group. Black heterosexuals are a racial group. And I'm saying this to say that ideas have been created that have suggested that there's something wrong or inferior about every single black racial group. And so what this means is that there are sort of many sort of forms of racist ideas, many different types of racist ideas that I sort of study and Stand from the Beginning. So I mentioned black women and black men. I study gender racism, which is this sort of intersection between sexist and racist ideas. One of the ways we can understand this is it's a sexist idea to say that women, because they're women, are weak. Like, women are weak. That's a sexist idea, right? And so what that means is, sexist, from a sexist standpoint, a real woman is weak. Then let's take the racist idea about black women, that they're not real women. You put those two ideas together, what it amounts to is that black women are strong And that simultaneously makes them not really what? Women. So the very prevailing and dominant idea of this strong black woman simultaneously paints them as not really women, because people who are strong are, from the sexist standpoint, men. And the people who are most like women from a racist standpoint are white women. Right? And so I sort of show the ways in which we have all these intersecting ideas denigrating particular groups. And not only do, let's say, white people create ideas suggesting that there's something wrong or inferior about black women, so do black men create ideas suggesting that there's something wrong or inferior about black women, that white women are more beautiful than black women. White women are this. And so, I chronicle, again, all of these ideas suggesting that there's something wrong or inferior about, let's say, black women or even black men. And that idea, when we sort of categorize a particular racial gender group as inferior, that is gender racism. Everybody follow me so far? So, but not only, are we sort of racialized as it relates to our gender, we're also racialized as it relates to our class, right? And so an elitist idea would say that poor people are lazy, right? There's a very prominent and prevailing elitist idea that the reason why people are poor is because they're lazy. If they would only work hard, then they would, of course, not be in poverty. I mean, most people don't know that those very poor people are working longer and harder hours than you are, but I mean, that's another sort of discussion. So that's a very prominent elitist idea. Poor people are lazy. A racist idea is that black people are what? Lazy. So you put those two ideas together, black poor people are lazier than white poor people. Or black poor people are lazier than black elites or white elites. Or black poor people are the laziest group in this country. And they just want to hang out on welfare and eat up our tax money. It's a very prominent, and so that idea and all of the ideas that people have created to suggest that there's something wrong or inferior about black poor people is an example of what I call class racism that sits at this sort of intersection between elitism and racism. Even ideas about black elites. So people say, you know what, black elites don't really care about, helping the poor like white people care about helping their poor. They're just so materialistic. They're just so into themselves. That's another example of class racism, targeting a particular class racial group as having something wrong with them. Now, when we look at the actual data, that's actually not true. But as you'll find with every single racist idea, every racist idea has either never been proven or has been thoroughly disproven. Another example is queer racism. And I'm sure from the previous examples, you could figure out what that is. One of the most prominent notions of homophobia is this idea that gays and lesbians are the most hypersexual people. It's a very prominent and prevalent idea. There's also a racist idea that suggests that black people are hypersexual, are more sexual than non-blacks. So again, you put these two ideas together, then it results in black gays being considered more hypersexual than white gays. That's an example of queer racism, or even black heterosexuals or white heterosexuals, that they're the most hypersexual group of people in this country. Now, again, the data says otherwise, but the data doesn't matter when it comes to racist ideas. And then finally, another sort of construct I sort of chronicle in Stand from the Beginning is this concept of ethnic racism. And what I'm referring to here is every black, so, you know, even in this auditorium here, each black person, you have black people who identify from an ethnic standpoint as African American, but you also may have some black people who identify as Haitian American or Nigerian American or Jamaican American. And so you have, but then they're seen, so they have an ethnic group, right? But then they simultaneously are confined to a certain extent to a racial group. So they have an ethnic and racial identity simultaneously. But within the black community, African Americans believe themselves to be superior to West Indians. And West Indians believe themselves to be superior to African Americans. Nigerian Americans consider themselves to be superior to African Americans. And African Americans consider themselves to be superior to Nigerian Americans. Just like Jews consider themselves to be superior to people from France, and people from France consider themselves to be superior to Jews. So even within every racial group, you have ethnic, right, groups, and so you have this ethnic racial hierarchy. But what's interesting about the ethnic racism within the black community is that each of these groups are largely using racist ideas that have been created about those groups, typically by white people, to justify their inferiority. So in other words, people coming to this country from Africa and even the Caribbean, consuming white Americans' ideas that African Americans are lazy and telling African Americans you're lazy and that's why you don't have jobs. Or even African Americans consuming ideas about Africa being this barbaric place with these barbaric people, and then telling those people that when they get here, right? You see, you know, this sort of intersection of sort of ethnic, ethnocentrism, and racism operating as it relates to ethnic racism. So ironically, I'm sure everybody's starting to figure out that, you know, I said that definition, very simple one, right? Any idea that suggests the racial groups are superior or inferior to another racial group in any way, but when you really sort of peel back its layers, it's actually quite sophisticated. And there are many different ideas, racist ideas, that we've created because there are many different groups of black people. Another way that I want to sort of explain this, and you know, instead of, I should say that one of the reasons I'm sort of speaking in this way is because I don't want to give away the narrative of Stand from the Beginning. So Stand from the Beginning reads, of course, like a story. It's really upwards of 600-year history of racist ideas, and it chronicles this sort of entire history. And it has these major characters. The first major character is a Boston theologian you may know by the name of Cotton Mather, who's probably the most famous American theologian during the early colonial era. The next major character, you may not know him, Thomas Jefferson. William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous white male abolitionist, is the third major character. W.E.B. Du Bois was the fourth major character, and finally Angela Davis is the last major character. And sort of the narrative sort of flows to a certain extent through the lives of these major characters. It's not necessarily 5 biographies, as much as their lives sort of serve as windows, not as beautiful as these windows, but you know, windows to this sort of larger debate about race in America that each of these individuals were basically central figures in. But I didn't want to sort of give away the narrative as much as I wanted to sort of give you some of the context and some of the way that I sort of framed the text in and of itself. And one of the most important frames in the text was I actually chronicled not a two-way debate about race in America between, let's say, racist ideas and what I call anti-racist ideas, but a three-way debate. So the racial debate has largely been a three-way debate throughout American history. And I chronicle this three-way debate with actually 2 kinds of racist ideas. constantly sort of in debate with anti-racist ideas. And again, I'm saying anti-racist ideas very purposefully because there's no such thing as non-racism. So I know a lot of people would say that, oh, I'm not a racist. So it means they're not racist. So that means they've adopted this sort of category of non-racism. But I think what they don't know, and what I didn't know when I was sort of saying this too, is that every racist in American history has identified as a non-racist. Every single one. I have yet to come across any figure in this book. They would say their ideas are not racist. And really, either you believe that the racial groups are equal, which are anti-racist ideas, or you believe in racial hierarchy, which are racist ideas. That's really the only sort of two. Either you look out at racial disparities and say, you know what, there's something wrong with racial discrimination, or you look out, which is an anti-racist perspective, or you look out at racial disparities and say there's something wrong with some groups of people. Those are the only two perspectives. There's no such thing as non-racism. And so in the book, again, I chronicle two types of racist ideas, challenging anti-racist ideas. And these two types of racist ideas, one of the ways so we can understand them is really they were involved in the nature versus nurture debate. So, and what I mean by that is one group of racist ideas was saying that black people are inferior by nature. And the other group of racist ideas was saying black people are inferior by nurture. One group was saying that black people are genetically and biologically distinct, that there's a such thing as biological races. And therefore, black people being biologically distinct and by nature inferior are therefore permanently inferior. And therefore, all these efforts of racial reformers to try to civilize them are stupid and will never work because these people are by nature barbaric. That is what I call the segregationist position. But then the nurture side says that no, these people are created equal. But over time, as a result of being born and bred in that barbaric pathological culture, whether African American culture, Nigerian culture, or any other black culture, or being the result of being born and bred in that barbaric system of oppression, slavery, segregation, or even poverty, they have become inferior. But because they were created equal, we have the capacity to civilize and develop them. And that's what we should do. While segregationists were like, no, we can't civilize and develop them. That's impossible. They're by nature inferior. But again, this nurture group, which in the book I call assimilationist ideas, states that no, we can civilize and develop them. Now, I'm sure everybody can understand what becomes the standard of civilization and development. But then you have anti-racists who historically have said, well, actually, not only are black people not inferior by nature, they're not even inferior by nurture. That there's nothing inferior about the cultures that people of African descent have produced. And that when you state that there's something wrong with those cultures, you're exhibiting a cultural subjectivity in which you're taking your culture, standardizing it, and measuring another culture from it, which is inherently subjective. Or they're saying that, yes, it is the case, anti-racists say. It is the case that slavery was dehumanizing. It is the case that poverty today is dehumanizing. But that doesn't mean that it literally dehumanized black people. That the beauty of human beings is that they have been able to create despite oppressive environments. that they have been able to maintain their humanity despite oppressive environments. And so again, this really has been the three-way debate, because assimilationists have said that yes, it is the case that there is racial discrimination, and that is a problem, and we need to challenge that. But it's also the case that there's something wrong with black people. And so we need to civilize them. So not only do we need to challenge racial discrimination, we also need to civilize black people. So I'm sure everybody could sort of see anti-racists saying, no, the focus should be on racial discrimination. Segregationists saying that, you know what? There's nothing we can do. These disparities will always exist because these people are inferior, and the main problem and cause of these disparities are black inferiority. And assimilationists looking at both groups and saying, no, you're both wrong. Yes, there is something wrong with black inferiority, but there's also something wrong with racial discrimination. And again, this has been the three-way debate that occurred throughout American history. A century ago, when Americans were involved in, for the lack of a better term, the lynching era, there was a three-way debate about lynching. You had one side stating that the problem, the cause of lynching, is because all these beastly black males keep raping people. And that the lynchers, wanting to defend their, quote, women, of course they're going to defend them by lynching these people. Then on the other side of the equation, you had people like Ida B. Wells and others stating, well, actually, when you look at the actual data, most people who are being lynched are not even being, most people who were lynched were people who were not even charged with rape, let alone actually did rape. And that the reason why people are being lynched is because they're defying Jim Crow, or they're excelling, they're advancing, they're owning property, right? They're defying the racist ideas of the day. So really, the cause of lynching is to suppress black uplift through violence. And then the middle group was like, yes, it is the case, you're right, Ida B, you are right. You know, these people are trying to suppress black uplift, but there is still a black beastly rape problem. There is a problem with these people and their criminality. And the reason why they're so criminal-like and beastly is because they were dehumanized by slavery, and they're still getting over that. This was the three-way debate about lynching. And you fast forward 100 years to the debate we've been having over the last few years about race and policing, and we see a similar three-way debate. Each side of the debate has its own slogan. You have the Blue Lives Matter crowd, the Black Lives Matter crowd, and the what? All Lives Matter crowd. And each crowd has different positions. Each crowd sees different problems and different solutions, right? The Blue Lives Matter crowd says, you know what? There's a war on cops. And what we need to do is figure out ways to better protect our police officers. You don't remember that police officer that was killed in Dallas or New Orleans or New York City? That is the fundamental problem. And they're being murdered and brutalized by these vicious black people who are engaging in all of this violent crime because the black family is in ruins. That's the argument. There's a book last year came out called The War on Cops by Heather McDonald, in which that's basically the argument that she makes. And then on the other side of the equation has been, of course, the Black Lives Matter crowd that stated that no, actually, the problem, the main issue, is that there's a war on black lives. And then they start citing statistics. That last year, roughly 33% of the American population was people of color, but people of color made up 63% of the people killed by police. That last year, young black men were 9 times more likely to be killed by police than any other group. And that the reason this is happening is because of racial discrimination, is because of racist policies, is because of the racist ideas of police officers. And then you've had this sort of third group. The All Lives Matter crowd has said, no, both of y'all are wrong. That there is a problem, and that there is a problem, and that there is a war against cops, that too many cops are dying, and they're dying as a result of these people, and we need to care about their lives. But yes, it is the case that too many black people are dying too. And so we need to care about them too. So from my standpoint, all lives matter, that it's equal, that yes, it is the case that there is a black-on-black crime problem, that there is a black violence problem that's leading to the deaths of black people and cops, but there's also a problem of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, and that we need to work on both problems. This is the three-way debate we've been having. It's the same three-way debate we've been having about every racial disparity, every racial problem America has ever had, in which one position states that it's purely the result of black inferiority, another states it's the result of racial discrimination, and another states, no, it's both. And what's interesting, and I didn't realize this until writing Stand from the Beginning, is that, and I didn't realize this, I should say even more specifically, until I defined a racist idea, is that even black people have been involved in this debate, sometimes on the racist side. That black people too can express racist ideas. And I didn't really realize that from recognizing the racist ideas that other black people had expressed. I realized that recognizing the racist ideas that I had expressed, that I believed when I began writing this book. Like one of the more popular ones and long-standing ones that I believe, which is probably the most dangerous racist idea, is the idea of the dangerous black neighborhood. That black neighborhoods are more dangerous than white neighborhoods. Anybody heard of that idea? Right, and that idea is based on, if you ask somebody, okay, how is it the case that black neighborhoods are more dangerous, they're going to bring up crime statistics, right? Crime statistics. And those crime statistics are based on arrest and incarceration rates. What that means is not actual crime levels, but arrest and incarceration rates. Does everybody understand that? So there's one thing to commit a crime, it's another thing to get arrested for a crime. And you have people committing crimes every day. I'm sure some of you did before you got here. People committing crimes every day who are not arrested. But we as a society believe that if a community has higher levels of arrest and incarceration, it must have higher levels of crime. But then when we look at the data and we see that most Americans, especially over the last 30 years, have went to prison for drug-related crimes. And then we see that the racial groups sell and consume drugs at equal rates. And then we see that black people are sometimes 10 times more likely to be arrested for possessing or selling drugs. Then we begin to understand why there's such a disparity within the incarcerated population. Now the incarcerated population is about 40% black, even though black people represent about 13% of the population. But then some of you will say, okay, I got all of that. What about all of this violent crime happening in black neighborhoods? Well, and that's one of the things that I thought. Yeah, it must be more dangerous because, black neighborhoods must be more dangerous because of the violent crime there. But then I began to sort of think about even my own experience. My own experience growing up in Jamaica Queens. And for those of you who are familiar with Jamaica Queens, it's a huge black area. But there are communities that have higher levels of violent crime than others. And I began to start thinking, okay, why did certain areas have more violent crime than other areas? And I came upon data that found that across racial groups, that we find that violent crime levels correlate to unemployment levels, that violent crime levels correlate to poverty levels. So then I began, you know what, that makes sense, because in my neighborhood, which was more middle class, we had much less violent crime, my black neighborhood, than the more impoverished neighborhood down the way. Even some of these suburban black areas have much less violent crime than black areas in inner cities. So then I began to start thinking, okay, should we be calling these neighborhoods black that are dangerous, when there really is no correlation between blackness and violent crime? And I began to realize that, no, you know what, actually a better term would be a dangerous unemployed neighborhood or a dangerous impoverished neighborhood, right? But then what would that result in? How do we then fight violent crime? It's not by putting more cops on the street, right? By putting more jobs on the street, right? But then the very politicians who are stating that they're going to be law and order presidents or they're going to be tough on crime, right? That's not going to suit them, right? That's not going to benefit them. They want people believing that they are not the problem, right? That the people are the problem. They who are not creating jobs, are shipping jobs across the world, that they're not the problem, that the people are the problem. They want us believing that. And you know, even black people believe that. Black people walking around in neighborhoods that are actually not that dangerous, believing that their neighborhoods are so dangerous. And striving as people to get away. My goal is to just leave. I just want to leave the so-called ghetto. And therefore willing to pay for an overpriced house in a white neighborhood just to get away from those black people. Have they experienced? Were they the victims of violent crime? No. But I know it's coming because I'm in a black neighborhood. And so that's what I sort of realized. And I also realized that really racist ideas were primarily produced and created for black consumption, to make black people believe that they should be losing, that they should be dying, so they won't resist those losses and that death. So they won't run away because they've been led to believe they should be enslaved, right? So they won't seek to go into that more elite space because they've been led to believe that they should be in that impoverished space. So they won't resist racial discrimination. And you know, I think once I realized that, that sort of opened up a new world, right, for me. It really did. And I think, you know, in sort of closing, I just want to sort of mention two more points about the book. And that is that I think another way for us to understand American history, particularly the recent events in American history, and what I mean by the recent events is the election of Barack Obama and followed by the election of Donald Trump, which for many of us, it does not correspond with the way we have been taught America's racial history. You know, or even America's history more broadly, that America, we've been taught, particularly as a racial sense, has had this sort of steady history of racial progress. And that Obama was another, if not the greatest manifestation of this sort of steady march of racial progress that Americans have been on. Like, we achieved and defeated Jim Crow, and we've marched along and now have been able to, you know, progress to electing a black president. And then the sort of Trump came, and it was difficult. How do we sort of integrate that into this sort of steady march of racial progress when this person is clearly, and I would tell him to his face, racist. Like, how do we sort of integrate that? And what I would argue is that what it should show is what actually has happened in American history. That racial progress has typically been followed by racist progress. In Stand for the Beginning, I show a dual history or dueling history of racial progress and the simultaneous progression of racism. That when anti-racist reformers would break down barriers, would marginalize racist ideas that justify those barriers, that those who benefited from those barriers, those who benefited from those discriminations did not just retire, go home, and they didn't go home, they didn't retire. They figured ways to create new and ever more sophisticated barriers. Jim Crow was a more sophisticated form of slavery. Mass incarceration, as Michelle Alexander calls it, is the new Jim Crow, a more sophisticated form of Jim Crow. And so we have, as nations, defeated these racist systems, but in their ashes, more sophisticated racist systems have emerged. That's racial progress and the simultaneous progression of racism. And that's how you can have people like Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey or other black people who've been able to take advantage of the progress that the nation has made occurring and prominent. At the same time, you have people who were being killed like Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland. That is indicative of American history, having both. And that's really this dual history that I seek to share and stamp from the beginning. And finally, I wanted to sort of not only sort of chronicle this history of racist ideas, but I wanted to give us some semblance of how do we defeat these racist ideas. And how we defeat anything is based on how we imagine the problem to be, how we imagine the origins or the source of the problem. And so if we have been led to believe that the fundamental origins of racist ideas are ignorance and hate, then what are we going to do to defeat it? We're going to educate people, right? We're going to seek to persuade people. But when we realize that actually the people who are producing the racist ideas are actually well-educated, and we realize that they're not producing those ideas out of ignorance, we realize that really the true source of racist ideas are racist policies. And so if we get rid of the racist policies, we will get rid of the racist ideas. And so in the end, that's the sort of assertion that I make, that if we really want to create a nation without notions that certain racial groups are inferior, we have to eliminate the racist policies that cause people to produce those racist ideas and convince us that the problem of racial disparities are those people as opposed to the policies that benefit them. And so this is something that I believe actually is possible. And I sort of wrote this long history of racist ideas and I actually came out quite hopeful. And the reason why I came out quite hopeful is because, for the longest time, we've been trying to eliminate a problem that we didn't even know the source of that problem. And I hope that this book gives us the source of the actual problem of racism, and therefore gives us hope that we can end it.